So that was partly what I was interested in, was that we have a current generation of young people who are infused again by far left ideology. And one of the really interesting things, I think, in the last few weeks is how much that current strain of far left ideology is a slightly confused anti-imperialism that puts you in bed with some weird people, right? And I found the same thing when I went looking at these guys. So Donald Maclean particularly, but all of them express themselves very vehemently as anti-imperialists. They do not like empire. They hate the British Empire. And after the war, when they're still spying for the Soviets, they hate the rise of American hegemony. But they're perfectly happy to act in the service of a different type of empire, a Soviet empire that's pushing, what was the sort of Eastern Europe other than a giant empire run out of Moscow? I mean, you can't say it's anything else.
Hello, I'm Zeb Baker-Smith, editor at Aspects of History. Few scandals have captured the imagination quite like the Cambridge Five. Recruited in the 1930s, these infamous names would each penetrate the deepest recesses of the British intelligence system while secretly working for the Soviet Union. Their actions compromised operations, reshaped the nation's security services, and left a legacy that continues to echo in today's world. Joining Phil Craig on today's episode is historian Antonia Senior, whose latest book, Stalin's Apostles, The Cambridge Five and the Making of the Soviet Empire, re-examines the lives and careers of some of the most intriguing figures in 20th century espionage. She sets forth the world that produced these men, how they were recruited, and just how damaging their betrayal of information was. Coming up, Adrian Goldsworthy joins to discuss his new book, Athens and Sparta. Allies against Persia, but rivals in ideology, Adrian explores their uneasy relationship, which would culminate in the devastating Peloponnesian War. But first, settle in and enjoy the conversation between Antonia and Phil.
Antonia, welcome. This is the Aspects of History podcast, and I've been asked to talk to you about your amazing book, which I'm going to hold up to the cameras. I don't know if we're using video, but if we are, here is my much thumbed, noted, pre-publication copy of Stalin's Apostles. And, I read a lot of books. I occasionally write them. Sometimes it's homework. Sometimes it feels like I just have to get through it. This is the joy. It's written with a kind of novelist's flair. You're really in them worlds. You feel you can understand the atmosphere, the weather, the sights, the sounds, the smells occasionally. So good on you. I think this is going to be the first of many interviews where you're lavishly praised just like that.
I hope so, Phil. I'll lap it up all day. Thank you so much.
But I guess the question I had, and you must have had, and your publisher had, and your agent had, is that we've all read lots of books about these guys over the years. In fact, I think one of my very first jobs as a trainee at the BBC was to interview the guy Boyle, who wrote the book Climate of Treason back in the very early 80s. So there's been an industry around them. So why do we need another one?
Well, there's a few reasons. The firstly is that actually there's new stuff coming out all the time. So in the period of me writing this book, there were two massive tranches of MI5 releases. The CIA have released loads of stuff. Loads of stuff has come out of the Soviet Union and its fringes. So I used Albanian archives and Lithuanian archives and Polish ones. So that's one thing, that there is actually just much more that we can say for definite now than we could when, for example, Climate of Treason was written. The other is that I think these guys have had a bit too much of an easy ride. I think that the story goes that they were young when they were recruited. They were idealistic warriors, and even if they got it a bit wrong, because it turned out that they had they couldn't have known that Stalin was a bad guy, and it turned out they were serving the wrong cause. So they kind of get a free pass, and I wanted to untangle that and have a look at that more precisely, because I don't think that's true. And the other thing, which is related to that, is I was very keen to ask the question that I hadn't seen written much. What did Stalin actually want from these guys and from their intelligence? Most of what I'd read about the Cambridge Five had been about their effect on the British establishment. And because we're quite anti-establishment these days, it sort of seemed like almost like a victimless crime, like a heist, perpetrated against the establishment. And like, who minds that, right? The old boy network humbled. Well, good, right? So I wanted to reframe the way we look at these guys very much as the servants of a disgustingly horrible regime who were spying for that regime with their eyes wide open to its problems and its inequities and its horror. And I think that's a slightly different story from the one we've been told, with the benefit of massively new access to all the archival material. So what I was hope people will get from the book, that people who don't know the story will be astonished afresh at the scale and depth of their treachery. People who think they know the story will be astonished anew at actually this new way of looking at them as traitors in the service of an imperial Soviet enterprise.
Yes, that's right. And you talk about the Red Empire, how they are so important in creating this Red Empire. And much of your book and some of the most interesting parts and the most kind of difficult to read and moving parts are set on the fringes of that empire. The Baltics, the Ukraine, and places where there's all these intrigue to try and escape, and how these chaps just endlessly serve Stalin's purpose, which is to crush all dissent. But actually, it's funny, you say you didn't want, I think I'm quoting you now, you didn't want the Reform Club version, which is, yes, good chaps who went a bit wrong. And it's all about Britain and the British establishment, because it's not. It's about this new global empire, which is incredibly sinister. I don't know, even though you said that, though, and you didn't want to give them an easy ride, I felt that I understood them a bit better. And I think you also say this as well in the book, that they lived at a time not unlike our own, of sort of very angry, very strident, very uncompromising political debate. And if you place yourself in that time, you can just about understand why they went the way they did. I mean, do you?
It's interesting you say that. Obviously I tried to approach them with a very open mind, but I mean, one of the reasons why I kind of came to the subject in the first place was I had a long-standing interest in intelligence history. I studied it at university, but I had a kind of political awakening a few years ago when the journalist Ash Sakar said on national television, "I'm literally a communist." And I'd sort of been sort of knee deep in nappies for many years. I just sort of put my head back above the political parapet to discover that the far left was resurgent culturally and politically. I couldn't believe it. I was like, surely this idea is going to have to die at some point, right? And yet it never does. It just keeps popping up like one of those bunnies that you whack with a hammer and then up it pops again in a new disguise. So that was partly what I was interested in, was that we have a current generation of young people who are infused again by far left ideology. And one of the really interesting things, I think, in the last few weeks is how much that current strain of far left ideology is a slightly confused anti-imperialism that puts you in bed with some weird people, right? And I found the same thing when I went looking at these guys. So Donald MacLean particularly, but all of them express themselves very vehemently as anti-imperialists. They do not like empire. They hate the British Empire. And after the war, when they're still spying for the Soviets, they hate the rise of American hegemony. But they're perfectly happy to act in the service of a different type of empire, a Soviet empire that's pushing, what was the sort of Eastern Europe other than a giant empire run out of Moscow? I mean, you can't say it's anything else. So definitely the modern resonances were what took me there in the first place. But I also don't like history that's too occupied with the modern resonances. I like to look at it on its own terms. So I embedded myself in the 30s. I hope I got closer to understanding what motivated them.
Well, I mean, a lot of people from all sides of politics looked at the world, the Western world, and said, this is not working. Our economy doesn't work. It's collapsing. We have this incredible depression. Imperialism has become, coercion. Indians are being shot in the streets. People are being hung. It's time to move on from empire. It's time to recalibrate the economy.
Yeah.
It's time to man of action. And here's this guy, Stalin, transforming his society. And we don't want to read about some of the nasty things he's doing, but we admire him because he's different, because it's, I don't know, radical, and young people get excited by radicalism then and now. I mean, I understood, certainly, the way you described Philby's kind of personal embrace of all this stuff. I guess the bigger question is why they didn't change their minds. A lot of lefties did.
Well, I mean, you see, I have less sympathy for them than you do, actually, because in Britain, at least, there was a very strong left tradition that was democratic, right? So, on the continent, communism had much greater numbers, right? In Britain, it remained small, partly because we had a very well developed sense of a left that engaged with democratic traditions and was part of that world. Fabulous. You carry on. The problem I have with these guys is they were revolutionaries from the start. And by revolutionaries, I mean they approved of and agreed with the use of violence to coerce people into a utopia that they don't want to necessarily belong to. And you can see nuggets of them. I mean, we have little bits and pieces of where they were politically positioned in the 30s, but you can also see what their friends were sort of writing and talking about and the circles that they moved in. So, for example, there was a young man who was sort of leader of the intellectual ferment of Cambridge at the time when they were there. And he was like a massive fanboy of Bela Kun in Hungary. And not because Bela Kun was a communist, but because Bela Kun had used violence and terror to subjugate people to follow the vision. So my issue with giving these guys a pass in the 30s, which admittedly I know there is like horrific, depression and there's like whatever. My problem with that is twofold. One is that they were revolutionaries who believed in violence. And I think that's a problem in whatever shape it comes, left, right, religious, I don't care. Two, that there was sufficient coming out of Stalin early enough, of Stalin's, regime early enough that you could see absolutely what he was doing if you chose to look, right? And I think you had to find it because, it wasn't everywhere. But I just think, Phil, if I'm going to be signed up to spy for a foreign power, I might do some due diligence on what that foreign power is actually up to. I mean, but instead, we have testimony that Guy Burgess goes to Russia and he deliberately turns away from the failings. Beatrice Webb, who is the kind of the poster girl in the 30s for intellectual communism, writes in her diary about a kind of apostate from communism. She basically says, we all know that the rat's a bit stinking, but it's a beholden on us to hold our noses, right? They know. They just don't care. Because like all revolutionaries, when they're in charge, it's going to be different. When they enact violence, it's justified. And the thing that I find very confusing about their brand of utopianism is the number of people who have to die in order for it to be enacted. You're like, well, who actually gets the utopia? Like, who's it for? Why do you get to choose it? There are so many problems with them. So although I tried very hard to get under their skin because that's my job, I did not come away with sympathy for them politically. I thought that, and this is even before, which I'm sure we might talk about. This is even before the Nazi-Soviet pact, and and then certainly when they start seeing the show trials. Sorry, interrupt me at any moment, Phil.
No, I was just thinking we should perhaps talk about the characters a little bit as well. I think some of it is that they're in love with the idea of being spies, and they're very good at it. Some of them,
Yeah.
especially Philby. But I mean, very quick pen portrait of the main men and why and how good they are at being kind of long-term sleeper agents from the 30s onwards.
Okay, well, I'll do them in order of recruitment. Philby is first. He's the first one to be recruited. Philby is he's a chameleon. He can appear to other people how they want him to appear, which is one of the reasons why he's so successful within the establishment when he joins it, because everybody loves Philby. He's a great chap to go for a sherry with. He has very strong ideological commitments to the Soviet Union. He, I think, is, I don't like sort of psychologically diagnosing people, but I mean, Philby cared about Philby.
Mm-hmm.
Philby's world was about him. So he was recruited in 1934 by a Soviet illegal called Otto Deutsch. And Philby was, I think, just brilliant at what he did. The establishment gets a lot of grief for not picking up on these guys, but that forgets that A, these guys were really, really good, and B, there had been no. It was a failure of imagination. It took the unmasking of the Cambridge Five to reveal to people that it was possible that such a thing could exist.
Right.
Because it was so unlikely. What are the chances of, particularly during World War II, when Britain was in such peril, what are the chances of the fact that the chaps that you knew and liked were secretly leaking absolutely everything to a foreign power? So that's Philby, right? Really, really good. The next one he introduces is Donald Maclean, who is a tall and good-looking but slightly diffident young man. And the impression I get of Donald Maclean, who is quite hard, he's hard to get to. He's harder than the others. He leaves nothing behind. We don't have very much of his own words. So Donald Maclean, I get the impression that when he was at university, he was quite shy. He was quite serious. He was very committed to his political awakening. He did all the marching. He did all the kind of, but he did it sort of quite quietly. This was just a sort of studious, serious boy. And when he's recruited by Philby and Deutsch, he's basically destined to join the Foreign Office. And in order to rise in the Foreign Office, he has to kind of become someone he isn't, which is a sort of, slightly debonair, man about town, a guy who fits in at the clubs, a guy that you'd introduce to your wife. He can't be so easily the person that he probably is. And Donald Maclean goes on to develop a very serious drinking habit. I mean, we might talk about the drinking later. All these guys drink more than we can possibly imagine. And Phil, I am an enthusiastic drinker, but they make me look like a complete lightweight. They are unbelievable, the amount they put away. But Donald Maclean, more than most, a raging alcoholic. Donald Maclean is asked to give a list to Otto Deutsch, the illegal who recruits them, of likely recruits. At the bottom of the list is Guy Burgess. So Guy Burgess often attracts a lot of the attention because he's so colourful. He is a very flamboyant, out homosexual in a time where homosexuality is illegal. He has multiple lovers. He has multiple friends. He loves shocking people. He loves messing with people's minds. He loves being outrageous. He is also very, very clever and very, very good on the kind of arcane and incredibly undigestible Marxist theory. He's really, really, really committed and into this stuff. But that kind of serious side of him is wrapped up in a sort of colourful, well, somebody calls him like a colourful nut. And Guy Burgess provokes two very strong reactions from everybody he meets. Either they think he's kind of hilarious, darling, or they think he's absolutely horrible. He's filthy half the time. He's got horrible, filthy fingernails. He's smoking relentlessly. He's foul-mouthed. So he provokes very strong reactions in people that he meets, but he's never not colourful, which I think is one of the reasons why he has received quite a lot of a kind of attention from subsequent eras.
Then there's Blunt.
Yeah, the next one is Blunt. Blunt, again, I think gets most of the free ride because he likes a picture, therefore he can't be all bad.
And he worked for the Queen, for goodness sake.
Yeah, how can he, decent chap, just got it a bit wrong. So I think Blunt is one of the most misunderstood. I think Blunt is, so he's older than the others. He's about 5 years older. He goes away. He sort of, initially, when he's first at Cambridge as an undergraduate, there's a different vibe. It's more kind of Bloomsbury, and he joins in that kind of set. Then he goes away on sabbatical to Italy, and when he comes back to Cambridge, everybody that he's friends with have become raging communists. So Blunt just becomes one too. So his ideological commitment is less obvious than the others, although it is there. He reaches his ideological conversion through a kind of different route, through his kind of thinking about art. So like he goes on this ridiculous trip to Russia and is very approving of how they've rehung all the artwork according to the class of the artist, all this kind of absolute unbearable nonsense. So
He'd
But he's,
probably be hired a shot right now at the British Museum to decolonise the.
I know, exactly, exactly. He's probably written the paper on decolonising the National Portrait Gallery. Oof, I don't know if you've been there recently. Anyway, so Blunt, we can talk about him a bit later. I think Blunt has been misunderstood. I think he's a predatory man. I think his betrayal is breathtaking. He lies and obfuscates like all the time when everything falls out of bed. I mean, luckily he ends up having quite a miserable kind of time of it as he's being chased by British intelligence for decades. But yeah, pretty bad. And Blunt's original job is as a talent spotter, so he is recruiting young men because it's called the Cambridge Five, but actually, they're recruiting beyond their circle. And one of the people who gets sort of recruited by Burgess and Blunt is John Cairncross.
Oh, right.
It's a kind of roundabout recruitment. I'm, simplifying it, but he's brought into the fold, although he doesn't really know it's a fold. Basically, John Cairncross doesn't have any friends. He's really awkward. Nobody likes him. He's quite comedic. His autobiography is one of the most extraordinary pieces of self-deluded nonsense you've ever read. Like, it's unbelievable. It's so funny. Like, if you were trying to narrate a novel with that level of self-delusion, people would think you need to tone it down. So he's got a chip on his shoulder. He thinks the reason he doesn't get anywhere in his civil service career is because nobody understands his brilliance. It's actually because everybody finds him deeply boring and wearisome. There are question marks over his ideological commitment as well. Like, it turns out some of the more recent files that have been released by MI5 that he was the one who was most financially gaining by his relationship with the Russians. So they were paying for a flat, they paid for his membership to various clubs. They basically paid for him to try and get him to ditch some of his chippiness to become one of the gang. And he was taking money off them. And there are some very odd things still to be discovered, I think, about John Cairncross and his financial dealings later on in life. He's a very dodgy man.
Well, here are the cast of characters. They're all
Yeah.
working their way up through different levels of the establishment, and they're getting into a position where they can help their Soviet controllers, etc., etc. But then, as you say, the war and the Nazi-Soviet pact. Now, this is a big moment for the left. A lot of people do say, hang on a minute, we're anti-fascists. We've been campaigning against this guy Hitler for years, and that's partly why we're backing Stalin. Now they're best buddies. Is there any evidence at all that any of these five guys, for a second, thought, ooh, are we the baddies? Are we on the wrong side? Or were they just so in now that we're not getting out?
I think that's a really, really interesting question, Phil. So there is evidence that they paused, right? So we have an account from Blunt. Him and Burgess were on a motoring holiday in France when they heard the news, and Blunt said that he'd never seen Burgess look so kind of confused and distraught. And they raced back to Britain because, they wanted to be at home to kind of digest the news and talk to their various friends. There's a really interesting moment as well where there's another guy that they've recruited into the ring called Gowonry Rees, and Burgess goes to see him after the Nazi-Soviet pact. And Rees's subsequent version, I mean, you like all these guys, I mean, Rees is sort of lying as well. But this bit looks like it might well be true. Rees's version is that Burgess came around utterly distraught about the Nazi-Soviet pact, and that Rees said, I can't spy for these guys anymore. Stalin's on Hitler's side. It's upended my worldviews. And he says that Burgess sort of agreed with him at that meeting. Now, that clearly was just a feint, right? Because Burgess then subsequently goes to his Soviet handler and asks him to murder Rees because Rees knows too much. So, yeah, they're great friends, by the way. I mean, this is just, so Burgess is not without the kind of, desire to have blood on his hands. Philby asked some awkward questions of his handler. So they did they knew that it was seismic, and they watched a lot of their friends on the left retreat from there'd been a kind of broad left coalition led by Stalin subsequent to the Spanish Civil War, and they watched a lot of their left-wing friends retreat from that. The fascinating thing, though, and I think this is damning, is that Rees managed to stop spying, right? In America, Michael Straight stopped spying because of the Nazi-Soviet pact. And one of the reasons why it was pretty easy to stop spying at this point was because Stalin's terror had completely decimated the intelligence system. So, there were basically the brilliant apparatus that had been built up in the 30s of these illegal residencies abroad with illegal agents kind of recruiting people. Stalin had cannibalized them all by bringing half of them back to the Soviet Union and shooting the poor bastards. So that was their reward for serving Stalin so loyally. So it was very easy, actually, in the confusion of the early war years and in the post-Nazi Soviet pact, to not spy for the Soviets. You could have walked away. You could have taken advantage of that confusion. And actually what you see them doing, all of them, is off their own bat trying to keep those lines open, trying to force the issue, trying to make sure that they've got handlers, trying to make sure that they've got routes to pass information to the Soviets, trying to just double down and ensure that those communications channels are open. And that is not coming from the Soviets, it's coming from them. It's coming from these guys. So while we are fighting what is an unbelievably existential war against the Germans. And I mean, you know more than anyone, Phil, like at the period we're talking, Britain was, and its colonies, was alone against this threat. And while that was happening, these guys who were at the same time being brought in because of the kind of boom of government employment during the war years, these guys were giving our secrets to Hitler's ally on their own initiative.
Hello, Zeb here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben McIntyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also give subscriptions. Now back to the show.
These are not just foppish aristocrats who are playing a game with the British establishment. These were serious operatives, did very bad things to help a very bad man. But what were the top 5, as it were, really bad things that they managed to do in the war years and the early 50s that really helped build this Red Empire that you speak about? I mean, it's a massive question, but, bullet points. What are the really big things that they give the Soviets?
Well, what I'll do is I'll give you one each because there's 5 of them. So I think John Cairncross, the most important thing he did was be the first atomic spy. So it was him who gave Stalin the first indication that their nuclear weapons were even, a dream. So he effectively allowed them to kind of kickstart the rest of their espionage into the nuclear programs of the Allies. So that's one. And also, don't forget, this is again while he's allied with Hitler, right? So, who knows any of this information?
Like giving Hitler the recipe for the atom bomb.
Right. I mean, it's unthinkably awful, but they don't care. And then Cairncross was at Bletchley Park, and there were lots that Cairncross did, but I think that's his single most important contribution. Donald Maclean, I think, incidentally, is the most consequential of the 5 of them. I think he's the one that matters most. So the single most important thing Donald Maclean did, I think, was he was based in the New York embassy, in the American embassy rather, in Washington, but his hand was in New York. He was based in America through a lot of the last part of the war. And at that point, during the last year of the war, when the relationship between the Allies was fractious, beginning to break down, they were trying to work out the Americans and the British were trying to work out how they could do something for Poland, how they could maybe stop Stalin's seemingly kind of, relentless push east. And at the same time, and all of this was through diplomatic channels, and like they're trying to work out how. And so there is a gap between what the Americans and the British are saying in public and what they're saying to each other. And Donald Maclean is leaking to the Soviets all the personal correspondence between Roosevelt and Winston Churchill in that unbelievably crucial period.
Wow.
I mean, it's unbelievable. He had access to all the telegrams. So we have a small section of them from March 1945, because these ones are subsequently decoded. And that's what ends up sort of, leads to his unmasking. But almost all the telegrams that we have are to and fro's between the Americans and the British about the future of Poland. And it's their behind the scenes working out how on earth they can try and keep Stalin's hands off Poland. Now, you could argue entirely rightly that the single most important thing about Stalin getting an empire at the end of the war was Red Army boots on the ground, of course, 100%. But he had to cement that control through diplomatic channels. The Soviet Union was exhausted. It wasn't a case of just being able to, like, he couldn't fight another war at that stage. He was trying to do it all diplomatically. And he could eavesdrop on the conversations of the people he was trying to to outwit diplomatically. I mean,
That's amazing. So when he goes to Yalta, for the sort of big carve up, he knows exactly what Roosevelt and Churchill have been saying to each other.
he knows what they're all thinking. I mean, some of that is also like he's got amazing agents in America as well. These guys are not the only guys; they're just the best, right? So, yeah. In fact, I mean, there's a brilliant moment in the book by Beria, who's the kind of evil NKVD boss. His son is in charge of doing the bugging of the Allies, right, at two big conferences. The first one in Tehran in 1943, which is really instrumental to the future of Poland, and at Yalta. And in Tehran, the bugging operation is quite central. They kind of take it quite seriously. Yalta, like basically, Stalin says to him, "Look, don't worry too. Like, put your microphones in, but don't worry too much. We know everything anyway."
That's Maclean. That's Maclean, really.
That's Maclean. And there's so many other bits. I mean, Maclean. Can I do one more? I'm going to do one more Maclean because
You can do as many Macleans as you like.
So, okay, imagine this. It is the birth of NATO. The conversations about creating NATO are so sensitive and so top secret that they're being held in a unbuggable basement in the Pentagon. The French aren't allowed in the room because everybody thinks they're a bit leaky, right? No notes are allowed to be taken. The only reason, and obviously it's so sensitive, as we know now, because NATO is like a red rag to a bull to the Russians, right? And if it is now, imagine it in sort of 47. The only reason we know anything about what was being said in those meetings is because of what Nigel West unearthed in the KGB archives, because Donald Maclean had been going home every night from these top secret meetings, writing them down and giving them to the Soviet handlers. It's mind-blowing. That was Donald Maclean. I feel like I should have done him last because, like,
No, they're all good. Let's do Burgess.
Burgess. Okay, the most important thing that Burgess did. I think Burgess is often slightly overplayed, actually, because I'm not sure I can pinpoint like one crucial piece of information. He had his finger in all the pies, right? So he's the Cambridge Five are often called a spy ring, but actually it's quite of a misnomer because they're not really a ring. Cairncross is out on a limb. But Burgess is like, even Blunt describes him as the sort of apex point of a triangle between him and Philby. So Burgess is the one who knows them all. Burgess is the one that's closest to them all. Right. Burgess is the kind of, the guy at the centre of it all. So probably actually the most important thing that he did was the Americans and the British were on to Donald Maclean. And Donald Maclean was being followed and watched, but they need more, right? They don't know that it's him. They've decoded these telegrams. They think it's him for various reasons that you can read about in the book. So Burgess is in America at that point, behaving terribly, in his usual flamboyant way, and he ends up going. He finds out from Philby because Philby's embedded in the operation to track down the traitor, astonishingly. So because Philby's in Washington at this stage as an intelligence officer, and he's absolutely, in ways that I think haven't really been truly appreciated before, central to the investigation into McLean, right? So he basically so Burgess ends up coming home, whether he faked this incident that got him sent home or not is still up for debate. We don't really know. So McLean has suspicions that something's awry. Okay, papers are not quite arriving on his desk. He feels like there's something. So then Burgess comes to see him at the Foreign Office, sort of drops a piece of paper on his desk saying, "Look, let's meet here and at this time," and then does idle chit chat, and then it's Burgess who basically tells McLean, "Look, it's game over. They know everything." And we have, amazingly, among some of the more recently declassified files, we have all the Watchers reports from the time when McLean is under suspicion. And McLean, who in the couple of weeks he's been watched up to this point, has behaved quite well. He has this meeting with Burgess. He gets outrageously drunk. He's so drunk he can't stand up because obviously it's a complete shock. He pulls this woman, right, and the Watchers watch him take this woman into a taxi, and they're like, "There's this very unstable." We couldn't be quite sure whether the woman was sitting on his lap, but it did look very like it. So he's obviously completely thrown by this information, and then it's that it's more complicated, but it's that information that prompts McLean to flit, and obviously the flitting of McLean and Burgess, which is 75 years ago this April, will completely transform British society. It will break up the spy ring. I mean, it's seminal. So actually, I think Burgess's importance is more as a sort of, can I say, a lubricant for the other four?
You certainly can.
He'd like that. He'd like to be a lubricant, I
He would have
expect.
probably enjoyed that, yes. So what about Mr. Blunt, to be blunt?
So Blunt, does a few things that are very useful. One is like as a recruiter, and I just want to very briefly touch on this as a recruiter. So there are lots of other people who are signed up to his ring, but Anthony Blunt before the war he's a don at Cambridge. He recruits undergraduates. And I just thought, gosh, again, he's had a free ride on this. At the time, he was in his early 30s. He was a very respected academic. He was, he was charismatic and influential, and he was writing columns for newspapers about art. And he was recruiting 18-year-old boys into the service of the Soviets. I mean, if he was, it's grooming, right? To use modern parlance. It's absolutely extraordinary. So first of all, as a kind of recruiter and a kind of general thing, then I think, I mean, he did lots of horrible things. I would say among the worst are, he leaked all the details of the D-Day landings to the Soviets. So obviously crucial to the D-Day landings was this kind of entire program to deceive and kind of, make the Germans think they were landing in one place.
Yeah.
This one isn't particularly personal, I suppose, to the creation of empire, but it is, I just think, in terms of like the kind of horribleness of what they were doing.
Yes, how far they were in.
How far they were in. So, there was a reason why the British weren't informing their Soviet counterparts, right? They didn't want them to know, because the more people who knew, the more danger there was that these deception plans would fail.
Yeah.
And Anthony Blunt was put in charge of an operation to basically stop our allies, the Poles and the Czechs, from having any conversations with their counterparts in the field because of kind of stopping leakiness, right? So at exactly the time when the Poles and the Czechs are seeing that the war is going in one direction only, they need to kind of create their own nations in the ruins of the Reich. Anthony Blunt is the man charged with making sure that they have no communications with the people in the field, that the communications they do have, I would expect, are entirely passed to the Soviets, because Blunt has oversight over everything. So if you imagine you're the Polish government in exile and you want to be in conversation with the Home Army, you have to show your conversations, you have to show your kind of the telegram that you're planning to send to the Home Army will go past Blunt's desk. That end stage of the war, he has his finger across all these communication channels across Europe. And, everything that Blunt saw, the Soviets saw. The volume of stuff he gave the Soviets was extraordinary. So I think that's probably the worst thing he did. I think just in the end stage of the war, he leaked the D-Day plans and he crippled the abilities of the Poles and the Czechs. But, the Poles were the ones who were really pushing for their own kind of
Yeah.
autonomy. He crippled their ability to wrest their own destiny.
So Philby comes across as very, very particularly ruthless in this book,
Yeah.
especially in the way you describe the way he actively undermined the immediate post-war intrigues that were building to help people in the Baltic states and in the Ukraine. And that's kind of dark stuff. Was that his biggest contribution, or is that even worse?
So Philby at the war's end was basically, and this is extraordinary, isn't it? He was basically put in charge of British and at that point American Soviet counterintelligence, right?
Oh, no.
So the guy charged at the point where it was becoming obvious that there was going to be a Cold War. The guy charged with, acting against them was a Soviet spy. I mean, when you think about that, that's like horrific. So what happens at the war's end is that there are various projects by the CIA and the British, or what becomes the CIA and the British, to send displaced people from across Eastern Europe to the other side of the Iron Curtain to spy and agitate and try and act effectively a bit like an SOE, right?
Right.
So there are operations into Poland, into Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia. There are operations into later on. There'll be operations into Albania. All of those operations were compromised by Philby. All of them.
Which leads to the death and the torture and the execution of many, many people.
Yeah. I mean, a question I was asked by my publishers quite a lot was, put a figure on this, put a figure on this, how many men? You can't. There's just like no way you can put a figure on it. But what I did find, and also correct, making the direct link. So we have various kind of clues all over the place that you put together, but making the direct links is sometimes difficult. But in his otherwise horribly mendacious autobiography, Kim Philby talks about betraying some Ukrainian operations just before he was forced to leave British intelligence. And I was absolutely delighted to be able to track through the CIA archives the kind of course of these operations, which was these 3 flights of young Ukrainians who were parachuted across enemy lines into Ukraine, and the idea was they were going to join up with the partisans on the ground. And Philby basically admits in the silent water betraying it, and I could see for the first time the other side of that operation. I could see where the flights took off from. You can see how it worked, what and who these kids were, because the other, the operations into Ukraine particularly, I think, have been overlooked because a lot of the recruitment for the partisans that they sent into Ukraine, a lot of it was from the guys who'd followed Bandera, right? The Ukrainian nationalist who was kind of Hitler adjacent. So he was not a good guy, and there was a lot of and they behaved, and his partisans behaved quite badly. So there was quite a lot of dispute between the Americans and the British about whether it was reasonable to use Banderites. But when you go into the CIA files and you see their correspondence with British intelligence about these missions, you actually see that the boys that they're sending in 1951 were like 12 years old when Bandera was rampaging through Ukraine, right? They're not, so these are not like grizzled old Nazis who are being sent to their death by Philby. And even if they were, he didn't know. He didn't know. Like, who is he to decide who is innocent and who is guilty? Everybody who is being sent at great personal danger into Eastern Europe is being betrayed by him. And then there's a horrible irony as well, Phil, which is that one of the reasons it works so well is because the Soviets are absolutely brilliant at counterintelligence. So what happens is they set up kind of these fake organizations that radio back to British intelligence, but they like being able to see both sides of the coin of the picture. So it's really useful for them to have Philby on the other side. So by the time Philby's captured, all of these operations are so infiltrated. They're so riddled with informers and so compromised by the Soviets already. So when Philby is sort of unmasked, and the British and the Americans think, oh, well, this is why all these missions have been failing, right? But now we've got rid of this guy who was the linchpin between British and American intelligence for sending all these men across Europe. Now we've got rid of him, it'll be fine. So they keep sending these poor boys to die for a decade after Philby is unmasked as a traitor. So his legacy goes far beyond his far beyond his betrayal of individual missions in 1949 or whatever. It carries on beyond.
You say earlier, you said Blunt sends all this amazing information, and Philby betrays all his operations and everything that crosses the desk. McLean is sending to how are they sending these things? How are they sending information? Is it all different, or do they have electronic links to the Soviets, or is it just dropping off documents in a box under a tree? How does it work?
So here's an example of the way that it moves. So John Cancross, for example, is at Bletchley Park for a while. And he's in the hut where they're translating kind of these unbelievably sensitive materials. And these unbelievably sensitive materials are at night sort of packaged up beautifully, and they're sent under armed guard in a box meant marked private to, Winston Churchill, who opens it with, there's only one key or something, and and in the meantime, John Cancross is picking up the discards off the floor, stuffing them down his trousers, walking out of Bletchley Park, getting on a train, digging down inside his trousers, fishing out these like top secret documents, meeting his handler in an out of the way station in the suburbs of London, handing over these sheafs of paper to his handler, right? So they always have handlers, like Soviet guys, and that's another thing that I was really interested in, was it's not always a one-way thing. The handlers are saying, we want this from you, we want that from you, we want these things from you. So it's not just, we turn up with whatever. You're also tasked by the handlers with finding certain things, which also tells us quite a lot. But anyway, then what happens is the most important information is sent by telegram, coded telegram from the Soviet residencies. And actually that in itself is also really telling, because when Maclean's telegrams are decoded, or the telegrams telling about the information Maclean has been sending are decoded, you can see then by default where the priorities were, right? And that's why I found it very interesting in March 45, as I said earlier, the priority was giving Stalin information about what was being said about Poland, right? Wow. So that but automatically tells you what's important. The rest of the stuff is photographed and microfiched and put into kind of bags and sent overland, and it can take a while. And then actually there's this handler called Yuri Modin who starts his life as in Moscow, getting this information in. And actually it's quite he basically says they were sending so much that actually they were sorting it into piles of like, well, we'll look at this now and we'll look at that tomorrow. And he said, we never got round to looking at the tomorrow piles. There was just too much.
All coming in.
It was just all coming in.
Extraordinary.
So it was...
Gosh. Okay, last question, because I've already gone beyond the half hour. But it's a big question. You say you don't like them. It's almost from your interview today that you don't like them. And yet in a sense, your book is arguing that they're much more important than people might think, that it's not just the Reform Club, it's global geopolitics, and they are directly responsible for some of the building blocks of this dreadful Red Empire. So in a sense, you're beating them up, aren't you?
Yeah, good question, Phil. I mean, obviously, I couldn't write a book that just went, yeah, they didn't matter so much. So there was,
Not the
but
best pitch I've ever heard.
yeah, it wouldn't have been a good pitch. But in all seriousness, I think there has been, like all history, there's a kind of, revisionist and then pushing back against revisionism. So the most recent histories about the Cambridge Five have tended to emphasize the fact that, for example, in the mid-war period, there was a person at the KGB who, well, NKVD as it was then, who didn't believe them and thought they were all lying and everything. And I kind of unpicked all of that and sort of realized it was much more complicated than that. She was one person, her boss thought they were still worth listening to, blah, blah, blah. So it seemed to me that a lot of the reasons why we we had been downplaying their significance was because it was just, that's how history works, right? When the treachery first emerges, it's like, God, they're terrible, the traitors are blah blah blah, and then the next historians have to say, well, actually, were they that important? And then, so I just think that sufficient time has passed, 75 years. I stand by the fact that these five guys had a level of access and a level of prolificness, I'm not sure that's a word, that is almost is unmatched in the annals of spycraft.
And it really did make a difference.
And I think it really, really made a difference. And Phil, I just want you to think about a minute for the fact that all our most recent spy scandals are if a Chinese spy manages to get near a junior parliamentary assistant on a kind of, it's a big deal, right? We're talking about there was a period during the war, right, where the Soviets had oversight over everything at MI5, everything at SIS, everything at the Foreign Office, everything at the Treasury, right? It was basically transparent. Now, obviously, intelligence is only as good as the person using that intelligence. And the big thing that I guess is missing is, an insight into Stalin's decision making when he made his decisions and whatever, and that, Stalin, despite the reams of biographies and the reams of words written about him, is still somewhat of an enigma. So, if the question is, would the Soviet Empire have existed without the Cambridge Five? Then I'm going to say probably yes. Were the Cambridge Five instrumental in allowing Stalin to build his empire in the way that he actually did? Yes.
Yeah, well, that's the case you make really, really well and powerfully. But you also, it's very, I said at the beginning, as a novelist, you are a novelist, sense in it. You do catch atmospheres. You do make you feel like you're there. It's a terrific read. I think anybody will learn from it and enjoy it. And I couldn't recommend it more. So good on you. And actually, I'm going to try and get you. We haven't talked about the sort of the way it became the Great British Press Scandal. And I don't want to, because I want to sneak you back for my own podcast, The Scandalmongers. Sorry, Aspects of History, you can't have that. We'll do that separately. Agreed?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, always.
I'll hold you to it. Take care, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Phil.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family and keep your eyes peeled for new episodes. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.